Tonight, we're exploring the frozen world of polar bears, a place filled with survival secrets, silent hunts, and some of the coldest lands on Earth. Before we begin, leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. And if there's another topic you'd like me to explore next, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy Secrets for more relaxing journeys. Now get comfortable and drift into sleep beneath the quiet Arctic night. Far beyond the last forests of northern Canada, beyond the final stretches of dark rock and frozen rivers, there is a part of the world where almost everything feels unfinished. The horizon disappears into pale mist. The ocean freezes into drifting white plains. Wind moves across the ice for hundreds of miles without touching a single tree. And somewhere inside that enormous silence, one of the strangest predators on Earth quietly appeared. The polar bear did not evolve in a stable world. In fact, the Arctic that created it may have been changing from the very beginning. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, during the violent climate swings of the ice ages, the far north looked dramatically different from today. Massive glaciers expanded and collapsed over and over again. Sea levels rose and fell. Entire coastlines vanished beneath ice before reappearing thousands of years later. Some scientists believe that during warmer interglacial periods, parts of the Arctic contained far more vegetation than people imagine now. Ancient bears likely wandered through regions that were not endless white deserts yet, but colder coastal ecosystems filled with seasonal ice, rocky shorelines, and migrating marine animals. Somewhere during that unstable era, a population of brown bears appears to have become increasingly isolated in the north. And isolation changes animals in strange ways. Genetic evidence suggests polar bears and brown bears are actually surprisingly close relatives. Their evolutionary split may have happened only a few 100,000 years ago, which is remarkably recent for two animals that now seem so different. In evolutionary terms, polar bears are almost new arrivals. Some researchers even believe their transformation may have accelerated during especially harsh glacial periods, when survival favored individuals capable of hunting on sea ice rather than competing for food inland. That possibility changes the way the polar bear story feels. Instead of imagining a slow, peaceful evolution unfolding over millions of years, it may have been a desperate adaptation inside one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Arctic rewarded anything that conserved heat, reduced wasted energy, and improved hunting success on unstable ice. Bears unable to adapt likely disappeared quietly into extinction, while others slowly developed traits that made survival possible. Over immense stretches of time, the animal began changing shape. Its body became longer and more streamlined than most brown bears. Its neck stretched farther forward, helping it reach into seal breathing holes and maneuver more efficiently in water. Its skull narrowed. Its paws widened into giant snowshoe-like platforms capable of distributing weight across fragile sea ice. Tiny rough bumps called papillae formed beneath the paw pads, improving grip on slippery surfaces. Even its claws became slightly shorter and more curved than those of many land bears, useful not for climbing trees, but for gripping ice and prey. And then there was the color. At first glance, the white fur seems obvious. Camouflage, snow, ice, survival. But the deeper reality is stranger than that. Polar bear fur is not truly white. The hairs themselves are mostly transparent and hollow, scattering light in ways that create the pale appearance humans see from a distance. Beneath that fur is dark black skin, which absorbs heat from sunlight more effectively in freezing environments. Scientists still study exactly how efficiently this system works under different Arctic conditions, but together, the combination creates one of the most specialized insulation systems in the mammal world. And insulation matters in a place where winter temperatures can become deadly within minutes. The Arctic wind is often more dangerous than the cold itself. Open sea ice offers almost no shelter. There are no forests to block storms. No mountains in many regions, just endless exposure. So the polar bear's body slowly became a machine built for retaining warmth. Small ears reduce heat loss. A short tail minimizes exposed surface area. Thick fat layers, sometimes exceeding 4 inches deep, act as insulation and energy storage at the same time. Because survival in the Arctic is not only about enduring cold, it is about enduring hunger. Unlike brown bears that eat berries, roots, fish, insects, and plants depending on the season, polar bears evolved toward an almost entirely carnivorous existence. Their world revolved around seals, more specifically, seal fat. In the Arctic, calories are survival. Fat-rich prey allows a predator to survive long fasting periods when hunting fails or ice conditions collapse. And hunting there requires an unusual kind of patience. Many predators rely on speed or ambush cover. Polar bears often rely on stillness. They quietly wait beside seal breathing holes in the ice, sometimes for hours without moving. A seal may surface for only seconds. The bear gets one chance. Miss too often, and valuable energy disappears. In that frozen environment, efficiency matters more than aggression. There is something almost eerie about imagining that scene under Arctic twilight. Endless silence, drifting snow. A predator standing motionless beside a hole in the ice, while freezing wind crosses the ocean around it. Then suddenly, movement. One explosive strike, and silence again. That style of hunting may have shaped the entire species. Some researchers believe the polar bear's long neck and streamlined head evolved partly because of these hunting techniques. A narrower skull creates less resistance in water and allows more precise strikes through holes in the ice. Others suggest swimming efficiency may have been equally important. The truth is likely a combination of both. Evolution rarely follows one simple path, and the polar bear became astonishingly good at water. Despite weighing hundreds of pounds, polar bears are powerful, long-distance swimmers. They use their massive front paws almost like paddles, while their rear legs trail behind like rudders. Satellite tracking studies have documented bears swimming across enormous stretches of open ocean, sometimes continuously for days. In some recorded cases, females traveled distances so extreme that researchers initially struggled to believe the tracking data was accurate. But these journeys come with risks. Open water is increasing in parts of the Arctic as sea ice changes seasonally, and long swims can exhaust even adult bears. Cubs are especially vulnerable. Some scientists worry that increased swimming distances could affect survival rates in certain regions over time, though the full long-term impact remains debated because Arctic ecosystems are incredibly complex and vary from place to place. That uncertainty appears constantly in polar bear research. The Arctic is difficult to study. Storms erase tracks within hours. Darkness covers entire seasons. Sea ice itself drifts unpredictably. Even modern satellites cannot fully capture everything happening across the frozen ocean. As a result, many aspects of polar bear behavior remain surprisingly mysterious. For example, scientists still debate how flexible polar bears truly are. Can they significantly adapt their diet if sea ice declines? Some bears have already been observed scavenging whale carcasses, raiding bird colonies, eating eggs, vegetation, and even human garbage near settlements. But many researchers caution that these foods provide nowhere near the energy density of marine mammals. A polar bear can consume enormous amounts of seal fat in a single successful hunt. Replacing that energy consistently is extremely difficult, and perhaps that explains why the species became so deeply tied to sea ice in the first place. Polar bears are often described as marine mammals by lifestyle, even though they remain technically bears. Much of their life happens on frozen ocean surfaces rather than solid land. They travel with drifting ice, hunt from drifting ice, rest on drifting ice. Some populations may barely touch land for large portions of the year. In a strange way, they belong more to the ocean than to the continent. That dependence may also explain why polar bears appear almost ghost-like to humans who encounter them in the wild. Explorers crossing Arctic ice often described seeing distant, pale shapes materialize slowly from storms or fog. Against snow and fractured ice, the bears can become nearly invisible until surprisingly close. Their camouflage is so effective that seals sometimes fail to detect them until the final moment. And yet, white fur alone is not enough to survive there. One of the polar bear's greatest weapons may actually be its nose. Its sense of smell is extraordinary. Under the right conditions, polar bears can reportedly detect seal dens beneath layers of snow or locate carcasses from immense distances carried by Arctic wind currents. In a landscape where visibility constantly disappears into fog, darkness, and blizzards, scent becomes a survival map. Some scientists suspect olfactory ability may have been one of the most important evolutionary advantages polar bears ever developed, because the Arctic is not empty. It only looks empty. Beneath the sea ice, entire ecosystems move constantly through darkness and freezing water. Seals travel below the surface, searching for breathing holes. Fish migrate through narrow channels under shifting ice sheets. Whales pass through temporary openings in the frozen ocean. And above all of it, polar bears patrol a landscape that never fully stops moving. Perhaps that is why they fascinate humans so deeply. Indigenous Arctic peoples often viewed polar bears with a mixture of fear, admiration, and spiritual respect. In some Inuit traditions, bears were seen almost as beings capable of understanding human intention. Hunters sometimes treated them less like animals and more like intelligent rivals sharing the same frozen world. Considering how closely survival depended on reading animal behavior in the Arctic, those beliefs may have emerged from generations of careful observation rather than fantasy alone. Because polar bears do not behave like simple machines. They investigate unfamiliar objects. They solve problems. They memorize routes across shifting ice. Some researchers believe they possess extremely strong spatial memory, allowing them to navigate enormous hunting ranges despite constant environmental change. Others argue certain behaviors interpreted as intelligence may simply reflect instinct refined over thousands of years. The line between those explanations is not always easy to separate, and maybe that uncertainty is fitting. After all, the world that created the polar bear was never stable either. Ancient warming periods likely reduced Arctic ice long before modern civilization existed. Glaciers expanded and retreated repeatedly across prehistoric history. Some genetic studies even suggest polar bear populations may have dropped dangerously low during certain warmer eras before recovering later when ice conditions improved again. If true, it would mean the species has already survived major environmental collapses at least once before. But whether past survival guarantees future survival is another question entirely. Evolution works slowly. Climate can change quickly. And highly specialized predators are often vulnerable when the systems they depend on begin shifting too fast. Somewhere tonight, under dim Arctic light, a polar bear is still crossing drifting sea ice exactly as its ancestors did thousands of years ago. The wind still moves across the frozen ocean. Seals still surface through hidden breathing holes. Snow still erases tracks almost immediately. But beneath that ancient silence, the Arctic itself may already be changing again. The Arctic Ocean never truly stays still. From space, the frozen north can look calm and permanent, like a giant white cap resting quietly on top of the planet. But down at the surface level, where wind cuts across the ice and freezing seawater moves beneath it, the Arctic is constantly shifting. Ice cracks open without warning. Entire sheets drift for miles during the night. Massive pressure ridges rise upward like frozen waves where two ice fields collide. What looks solid from a distance is often fragile, temporary, and moving all the time. And somewhere out there, a polar bear is trying to live on top of it. That may be one of the strangest parts of the species. Polar bears do not simply survive cold weather. They survive on a landscape that physically rearranges itself every season. In many regions, the sea ice they depend on is less like land and more like a slow-moving raft floating over dark Arctic water. A bear can fall asleep on stable ice and wake up many miles from where it started, carried silently by ocean currents beneath the frozen surface. For humans, that environment would feel disorienting almost immediately. There are few landmarks, few smells except salt, snow, and distant marine life. During storms, even the horizon disappears. Ice blends into sky until direction itself becomes uncertain. Yet polar bears move through this world with remarkable confidence. Researchers tracking them with satellite collars have recorded enormous journeys across drifting ice systems that seem almost impossible to navigate consistently. Some scientists suspect polar bears may rely on a combination of memory, smell, wind direction, and subtle environmental cues humans barely notice. Others wonder whether the animals possess a kind of large-scale spatial awareness that is still not fully understood. The Arctic punishes wasted movement, so getting lost repeatedly would be disastrous. Somehow, the bears continue finding hunting grounds across a landscape that rarely looks the same twice. And hunting there is never simple. The Arctic Ocean appears empty from above, but beneath the ice, life moves constantly through darkness and freezing water. Ringed seals surface through breathing holes hidden under snow. Bearded seals rest near shifting cracks in the ice. Beluga whales travel through temporary channels opened by moving floes. Everything depends on openings in the frozen surface. Everything depends on access to air. Polar bears learned to exploit that. One of their most famous hunting methods involves waiting beside seal breathing holes for hours at a time, sometimes almost perfectly motionless. The patience required is difficult to imagine. Wind moves around them. Snow gathers slowly on their backs. Temperatures remain dangerously low. But moving too much risks alerting prey beneath the ice. So they wait, and sometimes the Arctic rewards patience with only a few seconds of opportunity. A seal surfaces. The bear strikes. Then silence returns again. What makes this even more remarkable is that the ice itself may already be drifting while the hunt happens. The entire frozen platform beneath predator and prey can slowly move across the ocean without either animal realizing it in the moment. In the Arctic, stillness and movement happen at the same time. That unstable environment affects nearly every part of polar bear life. Unlike animals living in forests or grasslands with predictable migration routes, polar bears often face changing ice conditions from week to week. A region that supported hunting one season may break apart completely the next. Winds can push sea ice far offshore or crush it together into chaotic ridges too difficult to cross efficiently. Open water can appear suddenly between feeding grounds. Sometimes, the shortest route simply disappears overnight. And yet, the bears keep moving. Adult males may roam across enormous territories spanning thousands of square miles. Females with cubs often travel more cautiously, balancing food searches with the danger of unstable ice and exhaustion. Young bears learning survival for the first time enter a world where experience matters enormously. A single mistake near thin ice or open water can become fatal very quickly, especially during the darker months. For part of the year, sections of the Arctic enter nearly continuous darkness. The sun barely rises, if at all. Twilight stretches across the ice in dim shades of blue and gray, while temperatures plunge lower and lower. In that darkness, sound begins carrying differently. Wind scraping across frozen ridges becomes sharper. Ice cracking in the distance echoes across the ocean. Even breathing seems louder, and polar bears continue hunting through it. Their sense of smell becomes especially important then. In conditions where visibility collapses completely during snowstorms or polar night, scent may guide them across enormous distances. Researchers have documented bears locating seal dens buried beneath layers of snow, detecting carcasses from miles away under favorable wind conditions, and navigating toward feeding opportunities humans would never notice. But smell alone does not solve the Arctic's biggest problem: energy. Every movement costs calories. Walking through snow costs calories. Swimming costs even more. Staying warm costs calories constantly. Polar bears survive partly because seals provide massive amounts of fat-rich energy, but successful hunts are never guaranteed. A bear may spend hours searching, only to fail repeatedly. That risk becomes even greater because sea ice itself never stops changing. During winter, large portions of the Arctic Ocean freeze extensively, creating broad hunting platforms. But spring and summer transform the region dramatically. Ice begins thinning. Cracks widen. Entire floes break apart and drift southward into warmer waters, where they eventually melt. In some areas, polar bears are forced to swim longer distances between stable ice platforms than they likely did generations ago. Scientists continue studying how significant these changes are across different populations, because the Arctic is not one uniform place. Conditions vary enormously between regions. Some polar bear populations appear relatively stable. Others show signs of stress linked to changing ice seasons. The complexity makes broad conclusions difficult, which is why polar bear research often contains careful uncertainty rather than simple predictions. Still, certain patterns are becoming difficult to ignore. Satellite observations show that parts of the Arctic now experience longer ice-free periods than in previous decades. In practical terms, that can mean shorter hunting seasons. Bears may spend more time on land where food is less calorie-dense than marine mammals. Some have adapted by scavenging whale carcasses left behind by indigenous hunts, or feeding opportunistically on bird colonies and eggs. But these alternatives may not fully replace the energy once gained from seal hunting on sea ice. And this creates one of the strangest tensions in the modern Arctic. Polar bears remain incredibly powerful predators, yet they are also deeply vulnerable to environmental timing. A few extra weeks without stable hunting conditions can matter enormously for body weight, reproduction, and cub survival. Especially for mothers. Pregnant females face some of the harshest challenges in the Arctic. After feeding heavily during productive hunting seasons, they eventually travel toward denning areas where snowdrifts accumulate deeply enough for winter shelter. Inside these dens, mothers give birth while surviving largely on stored body fat for months. When they finally emerge with cubs, the surrounding ice conditions can determine whether those cubs have a realistic chance of survival. If hunting opportunities are poor, everything becomes harder, and the Arctic rarely offers second chances. Storms can appear with astonishing speed. Wind can erase tracks within minutes. Thin ice may collapse under weight without obvious warning signs. Even experienced bears sometimes suffer injuries or exhaustion. Researchers have occasionally documented drowned polar bears following severe storms or unusually long swims, though the exact frequency and causes remain debated. What is certain is that the Arctic Ocean is far less stable than many people imagine. The word frozen creates an illusion of permanence. But Arctic ice behaves more like weather than geology. It forms, fractures, drifts, melts, and reforms constantly. Some sea ice survives multiple years, growing thicker and harder. Other sections vanish completely within a single season. Polar bears evolved inside that instability, which may explain why they became such adaptable travelers despite being so specialized overall. And perhaps that is why encounters with them often feel surreal. Explorers crossing Arctic ice sometimes described seeing bears emerge almost silently from fog or blowing snow, as if the landscape itself suddenly came alive. Against pale ice under dim light, a polar bear can remain nearly invisible at surprising distances. Then, slowly, the shape separates itself from the environment. A moving shadow, a massive white figure crossing drifting ice that groans and cracks beneath its weight. There are few places on Earth where a predator feels more connected to the environment around it, because the bear and the ice are tied together in ways that are difficult to separate. The sea ice creates the hunting platform. The seals depend on openings in the ice. The bears depend on the seals. Ocean temperatures influence the ice. Winds influence the ocean. Everything connects to everything else in a system so large and complicated that even now, scientists continue discovering relationships they did not fully understand before. And yet, despite all modern technology, the Arctic still keeps many secrets. There are periods during winter when entire regions become almost unreachable for research teams. Equipment freezes. Visibility disappears. Satellite coverage misses details happening beneath storms and darkness. Polar bears continue moving through those hidden months, mostly unseen, following routes across drifting ice that humans rarely witness directly. Maybe that mystery is part of what makes them so compelling. They belong to a world that still feels partly beyond human control. A moving, frozen ocean where survival depends on patience, memory, silence, and endurance. A place where the ground itself drifts through darkness beneath your feet. And tonight, somewhere far north under pale Arctic light, a polar bear is still walking across that shifting sea ice, exactly as generations before it once did, while the frozen world around it quietly keeps moving. A polar bear can smell a seal hidden beneath snow from astonishing distances, survive temperatures capable of killing a human within minutes, swim through freezing Arctic water for hours, and walk across moving sea ice that cracks without warning beneath its weight. And somehow, even after decades of research, scientists still believe there are parts of its survival abilities we do not fully understand yet. Because the deeper you look at polar bears, the less they resemble ordinary bears at all. Everything about them feels engineered for a world that should be nearly impossible to live in. Far out on the Arctic ice, Survival begins with heat, or more accurately, with preventing heat from escaping. The Arctic is not simply cold in the way most people imagine winter. It is a place where exposure becomes dangerous almost immediately. Wind strips warmth from exposed skin with terrifying speed. Metal freezes to flesh. Ocean water remains cold enough to trigger shock responses within moments. Yet polar bears move through this environment almost casually, as if the laws of temperature operate differently for them. Part of that survival comes from fat. A healthy adult polar bear can carry an enormous layer of blubber beneath its skin, sometimes over 4 inches thick, depending on season and food availability. That fat is not simply stored energy. It is insulation. It slows heat loss while the bear rests on ice or swims through freezing water. In some ways, the polar bear survives by surrounding itself with calories even before hunger arrives. And hunger always arrives eventually in the Arctic. That may explain why polar bears became such efficient energy managers. Unlike predators built for constant high-speed pursuit, they often conserve movement whenever possible. A polar bear walking across sea ice may appear slow and relaxed, but beneath that calm behavior is careful calculation. Wasted motion burns calories. Unnecessary running burns calories faster. In an ecosystem where successful hunts are unpredictable, survival often depends less on strength than on efficiency. Even their fur reflects this strange balance between protection and practicality. At a distance, polar bears seem brilliantly white against the snow. Up close, their fur tells a more complicated story. The outer guard hairs are oily and water-resistant, helping prevent ice from forming after swimming. Beneath them sits a dense, insulating underlayer designed to trap warmth near the skin. But perhaps the strangest detail is that the hairs themselves are largely transparent. The whiteness is partly an illusion created by scattered light, and that illusion matters. Camouflage in the Arctic works differently than camouflage in forests or jungles. There are few shadows on open sea ice, few colors. Everything becomes brightness, reflection, fog, and pale contrast. A predator that blends into snow gains precious seconds during hunts. Seals resting beside breathing holes may fail to recognize danger until movement suddenly breaks the stillness. But surviving the Arctic requires far more than hiding. One of the polar bear's greatest advantages may actually be its ability to detect what other animals cannot. Its sense of smell is so powerful that researchers and Arctic hunters alike have described cases that seem almost difficult to believe. Under the right conditions, polar bears can reportedly smell seal dens hidden beneath several feet of snow. They can locate carcasses from miles away if wind direction is favorable. Some scientists estimate their olfactory sensitivity may rank among the strongest in the mammal world. And in the Arctic, smell becomes a form of vision. During storms, visibility can collapse completely. Snow and fog erase the horizon. Long winter darkness hides movement across the ice. Yet scent still travels through the cold air. A bear may detect prey long before seeing it. It may even follow faint odor trails across drifting sea ice where no visible tracks remain. That ability changes the way polar bears experience the Arctic entirely. To humans, the frozen north often looks empty. To a polar bear, it may be full of invisible information moving constantly through the wind. And then there are the paws. Polar bear paws are massive, sometimes measuring over a foot across. At first glance, they simply look oversized, but every part of them serves multiple purposes at once. Their width distributes weight across thin ice and soft snow like natural snowshoes. Rough, textured pads improve grip on slippery surfaces. Fur growing between the toes adds insulation and traction simultaneously. Even their movement across ice reveals adaptation. Despite their size, polar bears can move surprisingly quietly when stalking prey. They lower their bodies slightly while approaching seals, reducing visibility against the horizon. Some have even been observed using chunks of ice or pressure ridges as cover during hunts. Whether this reflects learned behavior, instinct, or a mixture of both remains debated. But it reveals something important. Polar bears are not merely strong, they are strategic. And strategy matters because seals are not easy prey. Ringed seals, one of the polar bear's primary food sources, spend much of their lives beneath the ice. They maintain breathing holes carefully and remain highly alert while surfacing. A failed attack wastes energy and alerts prey. So polar bears evolved extraordinary patience. They can remain motionless beside a breathing hole for astonishing lengths of time, waiting for a single opportunity. There is something almost unsettling about that level of stillness. Imagine standing in Arctic wind while temperatures plunge below zero, barely moving for hours beside a dark opening in the ice. Snow drifts slowly around you. The ocean groans somewhere beneath your feet. Then, suddenly, movement. One explosive strike, powerful enough to crush through ice and seize prey before it escapes back underwater. That burst of strength is another survival tool few Arctic animals can match. Adult male polar bears are among the largest land predators alive today. A powerful forelimb strike from a large individual can generate tremendous force. Their neck and shoulder muscles are especially developed for dragging prey across ice and overpowering struggling seals. Yet, unlike predators built purely for combat, polar bears often avoid unnecessary conflict because injuries in the Arctic can become life-threatening. A broken tooth, a damaged paw, a deep wound during winter. Any of those can eventually mean starvation. This may explain why even massive males sometimes appear strangely cautious around one another. Dominance matters, especially near food sources or females, but survival matters more. In an environment where healing is slow and food unpredictable, reckless aggression carries real risks. Swimming presents another challenge entirely. Polar bears are exceptional swimmers, but the Arctic Ocean remains dangerous even for them. Their front paws function almost like giant paddles, while their rear legs help steer. Thick fat layers provide buoyancy and insulation at the same time. Nostrils close automatically underwater. And despite their size, they move through water with surprising smoothness. Still, long-distance swimming may push even polar bears near their physical limits. Researchers tracking Arctic populations have documented bears traveling through open ocean for extraordinary distances, sometimes continuously, for days. Certain females have completed swims so long that scientists initially questioned the tracking data. These journeys likely demand enormous energy reserves. Cubs are especially vulnerable during extended swims, which is one reason shifting sea ice patterns concern many researchers studying Arctic ecosystems today. Because the farther apart stable ice becomes, the harder survival may become for younger bears. And yet, polar bears continue adapting in subtle ways. Some individuals have been observed adjusting hunting behavior depending on ice conditions. Others scavenge opportunistically from whale carcasses or hunt different prey when seals become difficult to access. There is ongoing scientific debate about how behaviorally flexible polar bears truly are over long timescales. But what seems clear is that they are not passive animals simply waiting for conditions to improve. They experiment, they learn, they respond. Young bears especially appear intensely curious. Cubs wrestle constantly, but those games may serve purposes beyond play. They practice balance on slippery ice. They learn how bodies move during fights and hunts. They explore unfamiliar smells, sounds, and textures in an environment where experience can mean survival later. Watching young polar bears together sometimes feels oddly similar to watching intelligence developing in real time. Cautious, experimental, observant, and observation itself may be one of their greatest skills. Polar bears appear remarkably aware of environmental details. Subtle changes in wind, weakness in sea ice, seal activity beneath snow. In some regions, experienced bears seem to memorize seasonal hunting areas and migration patterns across enormous territories. Scientists still debate how much of this behavior reflects instinct versus learned knowledge passed indirectly from mothers to cubs through experience. The distinction may not even matter completely, because by the time a polar bear reaches adulthood, it carries inside its behavior thousands of generations of Arctic survival. Every movement reflects pressure from cold, hunger, darkness, drifting ice, and uncertainty. Every adaptation tells part of a much older story, one shaped by a world where mistakes are punished quickly and survival rewards patience more than power. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about polar bears. At first glance, they seem almost invincible, huge, silent, perfectly adapted. But the deeper you look, the more fragile their balance begins to appear. Their abilities are extraordinary, precisely because the Arctic demands so much from them. They are masters of one of the harshest ecosystems on Earth, yet they remain completely dependent on it at the same time. Tonight, somewhere beyond the Arctic horizon, a polar bear is crossing sea ice beneath dim northern light. Its paws spread carefully across snow. Its nose lifts slightly into the wind. Beneath the frozen surface, seals move silently through black water, and every instinct inside that animal, every muscle, every breath, every movement is still shaped by the impossible world that created it. Somewhere deep inside the Arctic winter, beneath layers of snow hardened by months of wind, a mother polar bear is barely moving. Outside the den, the temperature may have dropped far below zero. Wind sweeps across the frozen coastline, carrying dry snow through the darkness. Sea ice cracks somewhere in the distance, like distant thunder beneath the night. But inside this hidden chamber beneath the snowdrift, the air is strangely calm, warm enough for breath to gather softly against the walls, quiet enough to hear the small movements of newborn cubs pressed against their mother's fur. And that may be one of the most extraordinary survival stories in the Arctic. Because polar bear cubs are born into one of the harshest environments on Earth, while being astonishingly fragile. When people imagine polar bears, they usually picture massive adults crossing sea ice under pale northern light. But a newborn cub enters the world weighing barely more than a pound, nearly hairless, blind, unable to regulate its body temperature properly. In almost any other part of the Arctic, survival in that condition would be impossible, which is why the den matters so much. Long before winter fully arrives, pregnant females begin searching for suitable snowdrifts along coastal regions, islands, or stable Arctic terrain, where snow can accumulate deeply enough to support a shelter. Not every snowbank works. The structure must remain insulated against brutal winds while avoiding collapse during storms. Some scientists believe experienced females may return to similar denning regions repeatedly across different years, though the exact reasons remain debated. It could reflect memory of stable conditions. It could simply be that certain landscapes consistently trap snow more effectively than others. Either way, the search is critical, because once the mother enters the den, she may remain there for months. At first, the shelter itself is surprisingly small. The bear digs into packed snow using enormous paws, creating a narrow entrance tunnel leading toward a slightly wider chamber inside. Over time, body heat subtly changes the structure. The inner walls may harden and smooth as warmth partially melts and refreezes the snow. Ventilation openings sometimes form naturally, allowing limited airflow without exposing the chamber too heavily to outside temperatures. And somehow, inside a world of ice and darkness, the den becomes a nursery. The timing itself feels almost impossible. Pregnant females typically enter dens during late autumn, when Arctic conditions are already worsening rapidly. Food becomes harder to access. Sea ice shifts unpredictably. Storms intensify. Yet, instead of continuing to hunt, the mother commits to isolation. She survives largely by relying on fat reserves built earlier in the year during successful seal hunting seasons. In a way, every future cub depends on meals hunted months before birth even happens. That detail reveals how tightly connected Arctic survival really is. A female unable to build enough fat reserves may fail to reproduce successfully at all. Scientists studying polar bear populations have long suspected that changing hunting conditions can indirectly affect cub survival by influencing the mother's physical condition before denning even begins. And once inside the den, the mother's body begins doing something remarkable. Around the darkest part of winter, usually sometime between November and January depending on the region, the cubs are born. Tiny, helpless, completely dependent. They press against their mother's body constantly for warmth while nursing on extremely rich milk packed with fat. Outside, the Arctic continues moving through months of darkness. But inside the den, time feels different. The mother enters a state that researchers sometimes compare loosely to hibernation, though polar bears are biologically unusual compared to true hibernators. Her metabolism slows, activity drops dramatically, yet she remains more responsive than animals in deep hibernation. If threatened, she can still react quickly. This balance may be another Arctic adaptation, conserving energy while remaining alert enough to protect vulnerable cubs. And protection matters because cub mortality is harshly unforgiving. Many cubs do not survive their first years. Storms, starvation, accidents, thin ice, predation by adult male bears, and changing environmental conditions all create enormous risks. A mother polar bear invests extraordinary energy into raising offspring because survival odds are never guaranteed. That reality may explain why mothers become intensely protective. For the cubs, the den is the entire universe at first. Darkness, warmth, milk, the sound of breathing. They grow rapidly during those hidden months, fueled entirely by the mother's stored energy reserves. Slowly, fur thickens, eyes open, strength develops. The cubs begin climbing awkwardly across their mother and wrestling with siblings inside the cramped chamber. And above them, winter storms continue burying the Arctic in silence. Perhaps the strangest part is how invisible this entire process remains. A den can disappear almost completely beneath drifting snow. From a distance, nothing looks unusual. Explorers or researchers crossing nearby terrain may pass within surprisingly short distances without realizing a mother and cubs are hidden underneath. In some regions, modern thermal imaging equipment is sometimes used to help identify active dens before industrial activities occur nearby, because disturbing a den at the wrong moment can have severe consequences. The cubs' first emergence into the outside world may be one of the most dangerous transitions of their lives. After months underground, they suddenly encounter light, cold, wind, and open space for the first time. Researchers who have observed den emergence often describe the cubs as curious but cautious. They stumble through snowdrifts, climb over their mother, and begin learning how movement works on ice and uneven terrain. And almost immediately, the Arctic starts testing them. The mother now faces enormous pressure to feed. She may not have eaten properly for months. Her body condition has declined significantly during denning and nursing. Yet, she must now protect and guide cubs still physically vulnerable while leading them toward hunting areas across unstable sea ice. This stage may determine whether the cubs survive their first year. Young cubs lose heat faster than adults. They tire more easily. Long swims can become deadly. Severe storms may separate them from their mother. Even traveling across rough ice becomes exhausting. Scientists studying cub survival have noticed that environmental conditions during these early months can strongly influence survival outcomes later. And still, the mother keeps moving. Watching a female with cubs crossing Arctic terrain reveals a completely different side of polar bear behavior than the image most people imagine. The pace changes. The bear pauses more frequently. She scans constantly. Cubs follow closely behind, often stepping almost directly into tracks left by their mother to conserve energy in deep snow. There is something deeply ancient about the scene. A white bear moving silently through endless ice, while tiny cubs struggle to keep pace behind her under pale Arctic light. The survival knowledge being transferred in those moments is older than human civilization in the north. Every movement contains lessons about terrain, danger, weather, hunting, and patience. And much of that learning happens through observation rather than direct instruction. Cubs watch everything. They study how their mother reacts to scents carried on the wind. They learn when to stay still near seal breathing holes. They imitate body posture during stalking attempts. Play fighting between siblings may also serve hidden purposes, developing balance, coordination, and social awareness necessary later in life. Some scientists even suspect young polar bears may retain complex spatial memories from early journeys alongside their mothers, helping them navigate Arctic landscapes years later as independent adults. The exact extent of that learning remains difficult to measure, but experience clearly matters because the Arctic punishes inexperience quickly. Young bears separated too early from their mothers often struggle. Successful hunting requires more than instinct alone. Timing matters. Ice conditions matter. Energy conservation matters. A slight mistake during a hunt can waste precious calories. Misjudging thin ice can become fatal. Perhaps that is why polar bear motherhood lasts relatively long compared to many predators. Cubs may remain with their mother for over 2 years before becoming fully independent. During that time, she teaches survival simply by surviving beside them. And in the Arctic, that may be the most valuable knowledge possible. But even these ancient survival systems now face new uncertainty. Researchers studying denning behavior have raised concerns that changing snow conditions in some regions could affect den stability and timing. In areas where warming alters snowfall patterns or sea ice access, females may struggle to find suitable denning habitat. However, the Arctic remains enormously complex, and conditions vary dramatically between populations. Some denning areas still appear stable, others may be changing more rapidly. What makes this difficult is that polar bear reproduction already operates near environmental limits. The species depends on precise timing between hunting success, fat storage, denning conditions, and cub development. Disturb one stage too heavily, and the entire cycle becomes harder to maintain. And yet, despite all those risks, mothers continue returning to the snow each year. Somewhere tonight, beneath Arctic drifts shaped by months of wind, another hidden den may already exist. Inside it, newborn cubs are pressed against their mother while storms move silently overhead. They have never seen the ocean, never felt Arctic wind, never stepped onto sea ice. But soon, they will emerge into one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and everything they become will begin inside that small chamber of snow and silence. Out on the Arctic sea ice, there are moments when absolutely nothing seems alive. No trees, no birds, no visible movement across the frozen horizon. Just pale snow stretching toward distant fog while wind drifts slowly over the surface like smoke. To humans, it can feel empty in an almost uncomfortable way, as if the landscape itself has fallen asleep beneath the cold. But underneath the ice, an entirely different world is moving. Seals swim through black water beneath frozen ceilings. Tiny currents shift below pressure ridges. Air holes open and close beneath layers of snow. Somewhere under the ice, something breathes. And somewhere above it, a polar bear is listening. What makes polar bear hunting so strange is that it rarely looks dramatic at first. Most people imagine large predators as creatures of speed and violence. Wolves chase, lions ambush, orcas attack in coordinated bursts of movement. But polar bears often hunt through silence, through waiting, through understanding the rhythms of animals hidden beneath solid ice. And in the Arctic, patience may be deadlier than strength. The most important prey for polar bears is usually the ringed seal. These seals survive the Arctic winter by maintaining breathing holes through sea ice, surfacing regularly for air before disappearing back into freezing water below. Some also build snow dens over these openings, creating hidden chambers where pups can stay protected from wind and predators during the coldest months. At least protected most of the time, because polar bears learned to find them. A hunting bear may spend hours moving slowly across the ice, nose lifted slightly into the wind. At first, its path can seem random, but then it stops completely. Sometimes beside nothing more than a faint depression in the snow. Underneath that spot may be a seal breathing hole, and suddenly the entire frozen landscape changes meaning. The bear lowers itself carefully, conserving energy while remaining alert for the smallest sound beneath the ice. Wind moves across its fur. Snow gathers slowly around its paws. Minutes pass, then more minutes, sometimes an hour, sometimes much longer. This level of stillness feels almost unnatural for such a large predator, but the Arctic rewards efficiency, not constant action. A failed chase across deep snow wastes enormous energy. A missed opportunity may mean days before another successful hunt. So polar bears evolved into masters of controlled patience. Their survival depends not only on strength, but on resisting the urge to move too early. And seals know the danger is there. Ringed seals are not defenseless prey drifting carelessly beneath the ice. They are highly adapted survivors themselves. They maintain multiple breathing holes when possible, constantly monitor their surroundings, and surface cautiously. Researchers studying seal behavior have observed how carefully they approach openings in the ice, especially in regions heavily used by polar bears. In many ways, Arctic hunting becomes a battle between two animals perfectly shaped by the same frozen environment. One waits above the ice, one listens below it, and the moment between them may last only seconds. When a seal surfaces, the polar bear explodes into movement with shocking speed. A massive forepaw strikes downward instantly, sometimes crushing thin ice around the opening while attempting to seize prey before it can escape back underwater. If successful, the hunt ends almost immediately. If not, silence returns again, and failure happens more often than many people realize. Polar bears are powerful hunters, but Arctic hunting is unpredictable. A bear can spend hours waiting beside a breathing hole, only to mistime the attack by a fraction of a second. Seals are fast underwater. One missed strike can erase an entire day's effort. That reality may explain why polar bears seem so obsessed with conserving energy whenever possible. They walk slowly unless necessary. They rest often. Even during hunts, they avoid unnecessary motion. Every calorie matters because success is never guaranteed, especially during difficult seasons. Spring is often considered one of the most important hunting periods for polar bears because young seal pups become available beneath snow dens on the ice. During this time, bears sometimes use their extraordinary sense of smell to detect hidden chambers buried beneath layers of snow. And this may be one of the most astonishing survival abilities in the Arctic. A polar bear can move across seemingly featureless snow and suddenly begin digging violently at a specific location. Beneath the surface may be a seal pup hidden inside a carefully constructed snow den, invisible to human eyes. Scientists still debate exactly how precisely polar bears detect these dens under varying conditions, but scent almost certainly plays a major role. To the bear, the snow is not empty. It contains invisible information carried through air currents and trapped beneath ice. Sometimes, the hunts become even stranger. In certain situations, polar bears stalk seals, resting openly on the ice itself. These hunts require an entirely different strategy. Instead of waiting motionless, the bear may begin a slow, careful approach from far away, using pressure ridges, broken ice, or terrain irregularities as visual cover. Researchers and Arctic observers have described bears lowering their heads and moving almost gradually enough to blend with shifting ice shadows. At extreme distances under Arctic light, movement itself becomes difficult to detect. A pale shape crossing white ice can disappear surprisingly well. And then, when close enough, the bear charges. The speed can feel almost shocking compared to the stillness before it. For a few seconds, this massive Arctic predator transforms from silent observer into explosive force. Snow sprays across the ice. The seal scrambles desperately toward safety. Sometimes it escapes at the final moment, slipping into water just before the bear reaches it. Sometimes it does not. And even successful hunts reveal something unexpected about polar bears. Despite their size, they often focus first on the fattiest parts of prey rather than consuming everything immediately. Blubber provides enormous energy value in the Arctic, where calories are survival. A well-fed polar bear may leave behind significant amounts of meat after consuming the richest sections first. That behavior creates opportunities for other Arctic scavengers. Arctic foxes often trail polar bears at safe distances, hoping for leftovers. Seabirds gather quickly when conditions allow. Even younger or weaker bears may approach abandoned carcasses later. In the Arctic, almost nothing valuable remains unused for long. But hunting itself carries risks too. Sea ice is unpredictable. A bear focused too heavily on prey may encounter thin ice, hidden fractures, or dangerous open water. Storms can arrive quickly enough to erase visibility completely during hunts, and large adult male bears occasionally steal kills from smaller individuals, especially females with cubs. This may be one reason mothers hunt differently when raising young. A female traveling with cubs cannot take the same risks as a solitary adult male. Cubs tire easily and struggle in deep snow or rough ice conditions. They also attract attention. During difficult food periods, large males can become dangerous even to younger bears. Some researchers believe infanticide by adult males may occur under certain conditions, possibly connected to mating behavior or competition, though the dynamics remain complex and not fully understood. So mothers stay alert constantly. While hunting, they often position cubs carefully nearby while monitoring wind, ice movement, and surrounding terrain at the same time. The Arctic allows very little room for distraction, and perhaps that is why polar bear hunting feels so different from predator-prey relationships elsewhere on Earth. Nothing here is simple abundance. Every successful hunt exists against a background of exhaustion, cold, unstable ice, drifting storms, and uncertainty. A large male bear may appear invincible crossing the frozen ocean, yet even he lives close to energetic limits. Several failed hunts in difficult conditions can weaken a bear surprisingly fast, especially during late summer in regions where sea ice retreats extensively. As stable hunting platforms disappear, some bears become stranded on land for longer periods. There, food opportunities change dramatically. Polar bears may scavenge whale carcasses, investigate bird colonies, search coastal areas, or wander near human settlements looking for anything edible. But none of those foods truly replace seals. Seal fat built the polar bear. Seal fat fuels its enormous body, long fasting periods, reproduction, and survival through Arctic winters. Without consistent access to marine mammals, the entire energy balance becomes harder to maintain. And this creates one of the quiet tensions running beneath modern Arctic research. How flexible are polar bears really? Some scientists believe certain populations may adapt behaviorally better than expected under changing conditions. Others caution that behavioral flexibility cannot fully overcome biological dependence on sea ice hunting over long timescales. The truth may vary region by region because the Arctic itself is not changing uniformly everywhere. But one thing remains clear. Polar bears are not simply wandering predators surviving by brute force. They are highly specialized hunters shaped by one of the most difficult ecosystems on Earth. Every successful hunt reflects layers of adaptation built over thousands of years. Patience, smell, timing, memory, stealth, and the ability to survive failure repeatedly without wasting energy. Tonight, somewhere across the frozen Arctic Ocean, another hunt is already beginning. A seal surfaces briefly beneath snow-covered ice. Wind drifts slowly across the frozen sea. In the distance, a pale shape stands motionless beside a dark breathing hole, barely visible against the white horizon, waiting, listening. And beneath the silence of the Arctic, Both hunter and prey already know the next movement could decide everything. Even now, after decades of satellite tracking, genetic analysis, aerial surveys, and Arctic expeditions, there are still moments when polar bears seem to slip back into mystery. Researchers can attach collars to them, monitor their movement from space, analyze chemical traces in their fur and blood. Yet the deeper scientists study polar bears, the more certain questions refuse to disappear. How do they navigate such enormous distances across drifting sea ice without becoming disoriented? Why do some bears behave in ways no one expected? And how much of polar bear intelligence are humans still underestimating simply because the Arctic is too vast, too dark, and too difficult to observe properly? Because the truth is, much of a polar bear's life still happens beyond human sight. For large parts of the year, entire sections of the Arctic become nearly unreachable. Winter darkness swallows the landscape for months. Storms erase tracks within hours. Sea ice shifts constantly beneath snow and fog. Even with modern technology, researchers often see only fragments of behavior scattered across enormous distances. And sometimes those fragments feel strangely unsettling. There are documented cases of polar bears traveling hundreds of miles across moving ice with astonishing precision, returning to productive hunting regions despite conditions that appear visually identical to human observers. Scientists suspect the bears rely on multiple environmental cues at once: smell, wind direction, memory, possibly even subtle ice patterns invisible to people unfamiliar with the Arctic, but no one fully knows. Some researchers have cautiously explored whether polar bears may possess a form of large-scale spatial memory far more advanced than previously assumed. Others believe instinct alone may explain much of the behavior. The difficulty is separating inherited behavior from learned intelligence in an animal shaped by such an extreme environment. And polar bears often behave in ways that complicate simple explanations. Young bears sometimes investigate unfamiliar objects with surprising curiosity. Researchers working in remote Arctic camps have described bears studying equipment from a distance for long periods, circling cautiously, testing smells, even manipulating objects in ways that appear oddly deliberate. In some rare observations, bears have been seen throwing chunks of ice during hunting attempts or experimenting with unusual stalking behaviors depending on terrain conditions. Whether these actions represent problem-solving or simply flexible instinct remains debated. But either way, they suggest a mind constantly adapting to uncertainty, because the Arctic itself never behaves predictably for long. One season may produce stable hunting ice. Another may fracture early. Winds shift. Seal populations move. Open water appears in unexpected places. A predator surviving there may benefit enormously from curiosity rather than rigid routine. And perhaps that is why polar bears can sometimes feel strangely thoughtful when observed closely. Unlike many predators that move with constant urgency, polar bears often pause, watch, assess. Their behavior carries long stretches of apparent reflection, especially around unfamiliar situations. Arctic photographers and researchers occasionally describe encounters where bears seemed less immediately aggressive than intensely observant, almost attempting to understand what they were seeing before reacting. Of course, projecting human emotion onto animals is risky. scientists are careful about that. But even cautious researchers admit polar bears display unusually complex exploratory behavior compared to what many people expect from a solitary predator. And then there are the stories from indigenous Arctic communities. Long before modern wildlife biology existed, Inuit hunters already possessed generations of knowledge about polar bear behavior. In many traditions, bears were viewed not simply as animals, but as beings with awareness, intention, and personality. Some stories described them as hunters capable of understanding human behavior almost as carefully as humans studied them. At first glance, those stories may sound symbolic or spiritual, but certain modern observations make them feel less easy to dismiss entirely. Polar bears clearly learn from experience. Bears exposed repeatedly to human settlements often change their behavior around people. Some become more cautious. Others become bolder. Mothers with cubs may react differently than solitary males. Individual personality differences appear real enough that researchers sometimes recognize specific behavioral tendencies between bears encountered multiple times. In other words, not all polar bears think alike. And that creates another mystery. How much culture can exist in solitary animals? In species like whales, dolphins, elephants, and primates, researchers increasingly recognize forms of socially transmitted behavior, learned patterns passed between individuals or generations. Polar bears are far less social, but cubs spend years closely observing their mothers during critical survival periods. Hunting techniques, travel routes, denning behavior, and responses to danger may all involve learning to some extent. Some scientists wonder whether regional behavioral differences between polar bear populations could partly reflect inherited experience rather than genetics alone. The Arctic may contain traditions humans simply do not recognize yet. Then there is the question of memory. A mature polar bear may roam across thousands of square miles of drifting ice during its lifetime. Hunting areas change seasonally. Stable routes disappear. Yet many bears repeatedly locate productive regions year after year. Some researchers believe they may memorize large-scale ice dynamics in ways still poorly understood. Because the Arctic is not static terrain, it moves constantly, and navigating moving landscapes creates challenges most land predators never face. Imagine trying to remember a path while the ground beneath you slowly drifts across the ocean every day. Yet polar bears somehow manage it repeatedly, across environments where storms erase tracks almost immediately. The more scientists study Arctic navigation, the stranger it sometimes becomes. Certain migratory birds, sea turtles, and marine mammals appear capable of sensing Earth's magnetic field to aid orientation. Could polar bears possess similar sensitivities? There is currently no strong scientific consensus proving this, but some researchers have explored whether magnetoreception might play some subtle role in Arctic navigation alongside smell and memory. The possibility remains open, and the Arctic has a habit of humbling certainty. Even polar bear senses themselves still contain mysteries. Their sense of smell is legendary, but scientists continue studying how efficiently odor travels across sea ice under varying wind and temperature conditions. Cold air behaves differently than warm air. Snow layers trap scent differently depending on structure and moisture. a polar bear may detect things humans cannot even imagine perceiving. To the bear, the Arctic may not feel empty at all. It may feel crowded with invisible signals moving constantly through the wind. And then there are the behaviors no one expected. In recent decades, researchers have documented increasing numbers of polar bears scavenging from whale carcasses, bird colonies, or human waste sites in some regions. Some interpret this as behavioral flexibility helping survival in changing conditions. Others caution that desperation can also produce unusual behavior, and flexibility does not necessarily guarantee long-term success. The truth may depend on how quickly the Arctic changes compared to how quickly polar bears can adapt. But perhaps the strangest mystery is how resilient the species has already been historically. Genetic studies suggest polar bears survived previous periods of significant climate fluctuation long before modern civilization existed. Some researchers believe populations may have declined dramatically during ancient warm periods before recovering later when sea ice conditions improved again. If true, it would mean polar bears have already survived environmental crises severe enough to nearly erase them. Yet survival leaves traces. Population bottlenecks reduce genetic diversity. Environmental pressure reshapes behavior. Some scientists even wonder whether modern polar bears may still carry hidden biological consequences from ancient Arctic collapses humans barely understand yet. Because evolution is rarely clean or stable. It is survival under pressure. And maybe that is why polar bears continue feeling mysterious, no matter how much data humans collect about them. They evolved inside one of the least accessible ecosystems on Earth. Much of their existence happens in darkness, storms, drifting ice, and silence beyond normal human observation. There are still winters where researchers lose track of entire populations for months. Still regions where no human watches what happens beneath the polar night. Still behaviors that appear once, get recorded briefly, then disappear back into the Arctic without explanation. Some bears have traveled astonishing distances unexpectedly. Others behaved aggressively in situations where scientists predicted caution. Certain hunting patterns vary between regions for reasons not fully understood. Even denning behavior can shift subtly depending on snow conditions, ice access, and environmental timing. The Arctic refuses to become simple, and polar bears may reflect that complexity better than any other predator alive today. Because beneath the image of the giant white bear crossing the ice, there remains something humans still cannot fully map or measure. An animal shaped by a frozen world that itself remains partly mysterious. Tonight, somewhere beyond the Arctic horizon, a polar bear is moving through darkness across drifting sea ice. Wind carries scents through the cold air. The ocean shifts beneath frozen surfaces. Snow erases tracks almost as soon as they appear, and somewhere inside that enormous silence, the bear still knows things about the Arctic that humans do not. Long before satellites crossed the Arctic sky, before steel icebreakers pushed through frozen seas, before maps fully reached the northern edge of the world, there were already tracks moving across the snow. Human tracks, and somewhere beyond them, often watching from a distance, were polar bears. The relationship between humans and polar bears may be far older, stranger, and more complicated than most people realize. Because unlike many predators that evolved far from human civilization, polar bears entered human memory through some of the harshest landscapes people ever attempted to survive in. The Arctic was never a place humans casually wandered into. Every journey north demanded preparation, luck, and endurance. Food could disappear suddenly. Weather could trap entire groups for weeks. Darkness lasted for months. And in that frozen silence, the largest predator in the Arctic often became impossible to ignore. But the first people who lived alongside polar bears did not necessarily see them as monsters. For indigenous Arctic communities, especially Inuit cultures spread across northern Canada, Greenland, and Alaska, polar bears were something far more complicated, powerful, dangerous, intelligent, but also deeply respected. In many traditions, bears existed almost between worlds, part animal, part spirit, part rival hunter, sharing the same frozen environment. And perhaps that perspective emerged because Arctic survival forced humans to observe animals differently than people living in easier climates. In the Arctic, misunderstanding nature could kill you. Hunters watched wind patterns, snow conditions, seal movement, ice stability, and animal behavior with extraordinary attention. Polar bears became part of that system. People learned how they traveled, where they hunted, how they reacted to storms, and how dangerous hungry bears could become near camps or coastal settlements. But they also noticed something else. Polar bears often seemed unusually aware of humans too. Some traditional stories describe bears observing hunters from distant ridges of ice, following sled tracks quietly, or appearing near camps with almost unsettling patience. Certain Inuit beliefs held that bears understood far more than ordinary animals should. Some hunters treated successful kills with careful rituals or respect, because the bear was seen not merely as prey, but as a being worthy of honor. Modern scientists might describe this as cultural interpretation shaped by survival experience. Yet even today, researchers who spend long periods around polar bears sometimes admit the animals can feel strangely perceptive. They watch carefully, learn quickly, adapt behavior based on experience. And in open Arctic landscapes, where visibility stretches endlessly across ice, both humans and bears often notice each other from enormous distances long before contact happens. In a place that empty, nothing truly arrives unnoticed. As centuries passed, more humans pushed northward into the Arctic for reasons that had little to do with survival alone. Exploration became obsession. European expeditions searching for trade routes, new territory, or scientific discovery began entering Arctic waters in increasing numbers from the 16th century onward, and many of them were catastrophically unprepared. To outsiders, the Arctic often looked deceptively simple on maps. Just frozen ocean, white space. But explorers quickly discovered the region behaved almost like a living thing. Ice shifted unpredictably around ships. Sea routes closed overnight. Temperatures destroyed equipment. Scurvy weakened entire crews. And through all of it, polar bears remained perfectly adapted to the environment swallowing the humans around them. Some of the earliest written European descriptions of polar bears sound almost surreal. Sailors trapped in drifting ice described pale figures moving across frozen horizons during endless Arctic daylight. Others wrote about hearing bears outside ships at night, while darkness and wind hid them from view. In several expeditions, starving crews eventually hunted polar bears for food, simply to survive. But hunting them was dangerous. A wounded polar bear on unstable sea ice could become terrifyingly unpredictable. Explorers quickly learned the animals were far stronger and faster than many expected. Even large groups armed with rifles sometimes struggled under Arctic conditions where cold affected weapons, visibility disappeared suddenly, and footing remained unstable. And occasionally, the bears hunted back. Historical expedition journals contain scattered accounts of attacks near camps, sled routes, or trapped ships. Hungry bears, drawn by food smells, sometimes approached humans cautiously at first, especially during difficult hunting seasons. In certain situations, exhausted explorers became vulnerable in the same way seals did. Isolated figures moving across endless ice under freezing conditions. What makes these encounters fascinating is how often both sides seemed uncertain about each other. Polar bears evolved in a world with relatively few natural threats besides other bears and environmental hardship. Humans arriving in the Arctic represented something new. Dangerous, yes, but also strange. Some bears reacted aggressively. Others appeared intensely curious, approaching camps slowly while watching every movement. And curiosity works both ways. By the 19th century, polar bears had become symbols of the Arctic itself in European imagination. Paintings, newspapers, expedition stories, and museum displays portrayed them as creatures of the frozen unknown, white giants wandering at the edge of civilization. To people living far south, they represented wilderness untouched by ordinary human life. But that image often ignored an important truth. The Arctic was never empty. Indigenous peoples had already lived there for generations before European exploration intensified. They understood ice behavior, seasonal movement, animal migration, and survival strategies far better than many famous expeditions did. Some explorers survived only because indigenous communities shared crucial knowledge about clothing, hunting, sled travel, and Arctic adaptation, including knowledge about polar bears. Traditional hunters understood that bears followed patterns. They knew certain ice conditions attracted seals and therefore attracted bears. They recognized warning signs in tracks and behavior. In some regions, hunters could estimate how recently a bear passed simply by examining snow texture inside footprints or subtle wind changes around tracks. That level of observation feels almost unimaginable now, especially because the Arctic itself constantly erased evidence. Snowfall buried signs quickly. Wind reshaped entire landscapes overnight. Yet experienced northern hunters learned to read details most outsiders could barely notice. And polar bears learned from humans too. Researchers today believe bears living near human activity often modify their behavior based on experience. Some become more cautious after encounters with hunters. Others associate camps or settlements with food opportunities. In modern Arctic communities, problem bears occasionally emerge when animals repeatedly access human waste or stored supplies. This raises a strange possibility. For thousands of years, humans and polar bears may have been slowly studying one another across the Arctic, not in partnership, not peacefully, but through constant observation between two intelligent predators trying to survive the same unforgiving environment. And perhaps that explains why polar bears appear so frequently in Arctic mythology and storytelling. In some traditions, bears could transform between human and animal forms. In others, they symbolized strength, endurance, or spiritual power connected to sea ice and hunting. Certain stories warned against arrogance around bears, suggesting that disrespect toward nature itself could bring disaster. Even modern encounters sometimes carry an almost mythic atmosphere. Imagine standing on drifting Arctic ice beneath low northern light, while fog moves across the frozen sea. Then, far away, a pale shape emerges slowly from the whiteness. No trees, no buildings, no sound except wind. Just a polar bear walking across ancient ice, exactly as generations before it once did. In moments like that, it becomes easier to understand why early Arctic peoples saw something deeper in these animals than simple biology. Because the Arctic strips away many illusions of human control. Storms do not care about technology. Darkness does not care about ambition. Ice breaks without warning beneath explorers, hunters, scientists, and bears alike. And throughout human history in the North, polar bears remained one of the few creatures that truly seemed to belong there completely, at least for a while. Today, humans enter the Arctic differently than before. Aircraft cross regions once considered unreachable. Satellites monitor sea ice from orbit. Researchers track bears using GPS collars and genetic analysis. Industrial activity reaches farther north than previous generations imagined possible. And yet, the relationship between humans and polar bears still contains uncertainty. In some Arctic communities, encounters are becoming more common as changing ice conditions alter bear movement patterns. Certain populations spend longer periods near land. Hungry bears may approach settlements more often, searching for food. Scientists continue debating exactly how these trends will evolve across different regions, because Arctic ecosystems remain incredibly complex. But complexity has always defined the North. Even centuries ago, no one fully understood what waited beyond the ice horizon. Explorers vanished. Ships disappeared. Entire expeditions became trapped for years inside frozen seas. And somewhere beyond those human struggles, polar bears continued moving across the ice, hunting seals beneath the northern sky. Perhaps that is the strangest part of the story. Humans entered the Arctic, believing they were discovering an empty frontier. But the polar bear had already mastered that world, long before the first maps reached it. Tonight, somewhere beyond the northern coastline, wind still moves across drifting sea ice exactly as it did centuries ago. A polar bear walks silently across the frozen ocean beneath pale Arctic light, and hidden somewhere behind that ancient white horizon are the echoes of every hunter, explorer, and traveler who once realized the Arctic was never truly theirs to conquer. For thousands of years, the Arctic felt almost permanent. Ice returned every winter, Sea routes froze shut again and again. Polar bears followed hunting paths across drifting white oceans, generation after generation, beneath the same pale northern sky. To the people who lived there, the frozen world could be dangerous, unpredictable, even deadly. But it still followed rhythms that felt ancient and familiar. Now, in many parts of the Arctic, those rhythms are beginning to shift, and they may be shifting faster than even scientists once expected. At first, the changes were difficult to notice unless someone spent years in the north. Hunters described sea ice forming later than before, certain travel routes becoming less reliable, storms behaving differently, snow conditions changing subtly. Then, satellites began recording patterns across entire Arctic regions, and suddenly, the scale of the transformation became harder to ignore. The Arctic was warming faster than much of the rest of the planet. But what makes this story complicated is that the Arctic does not change in one simple direction. Some areas warm faster than others. Certain regions still produce stable ice seasons, while others experience dramatic losses. Ocean currents shift, wind patterns change, snowfall varies unpredictably. The Arctic behaves less like a single ecosystem and more like countless interconnected systems responding differently at the same time. And somewhere inside all of those changes, polar bears are trying to adapt. The most important detail is not simply temperature itself. It is sea ice. Polar bears evolved around floating ice platforms because ice allows access to seals. Hunting depends on it. Movement depends on it. Resting depends on it. In many regions, the sea ice functions almost like a living extension of the bear's body, part habitat, part hunting ground, part survival system. So when sea ice begins forming later or melting earlier, the consequences spread outward through almost every part of polar bear life. Researchers studying Arctic populations have documented changes in some regions, where bears now spend longer periods stranded on land, waiting for ice to return. In practical terms, this can mean fewer opportunities to hunt seals efficiently. And because polar bears depend so heavily on high-fat marine prey, even relatively small disruptions to hunting seasons can affect body condition over time. But the Arctic rarely tells simple stories. Some polar bear populations appear more affected than others. Certain groups remain relatively stable. Others show signs of nutritional stress, lower cub survival, or behavioral changes linked to shifting ice conditions. Scientists continue debating exactly how adaptable polar bears may be over long timescales, because the species has survived past climate fluctuations before. The difference now may be speed. Ancient Arctic changes unfolded over long stretches of time. What worries many researchers is how quickly modern conditions appear to be shifting in some areas. Evolution works slowly. Sea ice can disappear rapidly, and the ice itself is changing in ways that are easy to overlook from far away. Older, multi-year ice, thick ice that survives several seasons, has declined in parts of the Arctic, replaced increasingly by thinner seasonal ice that melts more easily. Thin ice behaves differently. It fractures faster during storms. It drifts differently under wind pressure. it creates less stable hunting conditions for seals and bears alike. For a polar bear crossing the frozen ocean, that instability changes everything. A hunting route used for generations may suddenly contain larger stretches of open water. Resting platforms may break apart unexpectedly. Swimming distances between ice floes may increase. And while polar bears are excellent swimmers, swimming is extremely energy expensive, especially for cubs. Researchers tracking female bears with young offspring have become particularly concerned about long open water crossings. Adult bears can sometimes survive enormous swims, lasting days under difficult conditions. Cubs often cannot. Even strong swimmers lose body heat faster in freezing water. Exhaustion becomes dangerous quickly. And yet, despite these challenges, polar bears continue doing what Arctic animals have always done. They adapt if they can. Some bears have been observed changing movement patterns in response to shifting ice seasons. Others spend more time near coastlines or islands during ice-free periods. In several regions, polar bears are scavenging more frequently from whale carcasses left behind by indigenous subsistence hunts or natural whale deaths. Bird colonies, eggs, vegetation, even human garbage sometimes become temporary food sources too. But none of these foods truly replace seals. A polar bear can consume astonishing amounts of fat from a successful seal hunt. That energy supports massive body size, long fasting periods, pregnancy, nursing, and survival during difficult seasons. Eggs, plants, or scavenged scraps may help temporarily, but most researchers believe they cannot fully sustain large populations long-term in the same way marine mammals can. Still, the fact that bears experiment with new food sources reveals something important. Polar bears are not passive. They investigate, adjust, explore. In some regions, bears now spend significantly more time on land than previous generations likely did. This creates entirely new interactions between animals, ecosystems, and humans. And some of those interactions feel almost surreal. There are now occasional reports of polar bears wandering farther south than expected, or appearing near settlements during unusual seasons. Hungry bears investigating coastal villages are not entirely new in Arctic history, but changing ice conditions may increase how often certain communities encounter them. For people living there, the transformation is not abstract. It is visible. Hunters notice unstable ice beneath snowmobiles. Elders describe seasonal patterns that no longer arrive on time. Coastal erosion increases as protective sea ice disappears earlier during storms. Even the soundscape changes in some regions when open water replaces frozen surfaces for longer periods. The Arctic itself begins feeling different, and perhaps the strangest part is how quickly the landscape can transform visually. A region frozen solid one year may contain wide channels of dark water the next. Summer ice retreats farther north. Snowfall timing shifts. Entire coastlines experience increased wave erosion because less sea ice remains to absorb ocean energy during storms. For polar bears, every one of those changes alters survival calculations in ways scientists are still trying to understand, because not all effects are immediate. A bear may survive difficult seasons repeatedly before body condition gradually weakens. Cub survival may decline before adult mortality becomes obvious. Hunting efficiency may shift subtly across years rather than collapsing suddenly all at once. The Arctic often changes quietly at first, and silence can hide danger surprisingly well. At the same time, some scientists caution against oversimplifying the story into inevitable collapse everywhere. Polar bear populations are spread across enormous regions with very different environmental conditions. Certain areas may remain productive for longer than others. Some bears may prove more behaviorally flexible than expected. There is still active debate over how much adaptability exists within the species, and uncertainty remains one of the hardest parts of Arctic science. The North is difficult to study consistently. Storms interrupt fieldwork. Darkness limits observation. Tracking individual bears across drifting ice remains enormously challenging. In many cases, researchers are still piecing together fragmented information across decades of changing conditions. But even uncertainty carries meaning, because when experienced Arctic scientists openly admit they still do not fully know how these systems will respond long term, it reveals how complex the frozen North truly is. The Arctic is not a machine with simple inputs and outputs. It is wind, ocean currents, snow structure, prey movement, ice thickness, storm timing, sunlight, darkness, and biological adaptation, all interacting at once across one of the largest ecosystems on Earth. And polar bears stand directly inside that complexity. Perhaps that is why images of solitary bears crossing shrinking ice resonate so deeply with people far beyond the Arctic itself. The animal almost becomes a symbol of environmental change visible in physical form. A predator built for a frozen world, now trying to navigate a landscape becoming less predictable beneath its feet. Yet even that image can sometimes oversimplify reality. Polar bears are not helpless victims drifting passively toward extinction. They remain intelligent, powerful, adaptable predators capable of surviving extraordinary hardship. The real question is not whether they can endure difficulty. They already do. The question is whether the Arctic they evolved for will continue changing faster than even a species this specialized can adjust to. And no one can answer that completely yet. Tonight, somewhere across the far north, sea ice is still drifting through the darkness beneath Arctic wind. A polar bear moves carefully across frozen water while distant cracks echo through the night. But the ice beneath that bear may not be the same ice its ancestors once knew. And somewhere, deep inside the Arctic silence, the entire frozen world may already be changing shape. In the Arctic, distance changes the way things feel. A shape standing miles away across sea ice can look almost unreal beneath pale northern light. Fog bends the horizon. Snow erases scale. Silence stretches across frozen water until even sound begins to feel uncertain. And then, slowly, the shape starts moving. A polar bear, but not always where anyone expected one to be. Some of the strangest stories in the Arctic begin exactly like that. A lone bear appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time, under conditions that seem almost impossible. A white predator walking across black volcanic rock far south of normal hunting ranges. A massive male drifting for days on broken ice fields, hundreds of miles from stable territory. A pale figure emerging beside remote fishing camps where local people had never seen a polar bear before. And sometimes, those encounters become so unusual that even scientists struggle to explain them fully. Because despite everything humans know about polar bears, the Arctic still produces moments that feel unpredictable, almost ghost-like. One of the strangest examples involves hybrid bears. For most of modern history, polar bears and brown bears existed in largely separate worlds. One belonged to drifting Arctic sea ice. The other survived mostly in forests, mountains, tundra, and inland environments farther south. Yet, genetic studies eventually confirmed something surprising. The two species never became fully separate biologically. They can still reproduce together. In rare cases, hybrid offspring have been documented in northern regions where changing environmental conditions brought the species into closer contact. Some people began calling these animals Pizzly bears or growler bears, though scientists generally use more cautious terminology. The hybrids often display strange combinations of traits: slightly longer necks than brown bears, different fur coloration, altered body proportions, and behavioral patterns that do not perfectly match either parent species, and their existence raises unsettling questions. If Arctic conditions continue shifting, could hybridization become more common in certain areas? Would that represent adaptation or evidence of ecological disruption? Scientists do not fully agree. Some researchers view hybrids mainly as rare natural events, unlikely to reshape the species significantly. Others wonder whether future environmental pressures could gradually blur boundaries that once remained more stable. The Arctic rarely offers clear answers, and the hybrids themselves feel almost symbolic of a world changing faster than expected. Creatures standing between two ecosystems that historically remained far apart. But hybrids are only part of the mystery. There are also the long-distance wanderers. Every so often, reports emerge of polar bears appearing astonishingly far from their expected range. Some bears drift south on unstable ice. Others seem to travel enormous distances independently across coastal regions and frozen waterways. In a few documented cases, bears reached areas where local communities had little recent memory of seeing them at all. To people encountering them unexpectedly, the experience can feel deeply surreal. Imagine walking along a remote northern shoreline under gray Arctic light, expecting nothing but rock, snow, and ocean, then noticing a giant white animal standing silently in the distance, watching you. In environments that empty, encounters carry unusual psychological weight. There are no crowds, no fences, no safe boundaries separating human from predator. Just open land, freezing wind, and an animal fully capable of killing a person if conditions turn dangerous. Yet many encounters do not unfold violently at all. Some polar bears approach humans with what researchers describe as cautious curiosity rather than immediate aggression. They stop frequently, smell the air, circle at a distance, watch carefully. In regions with limited human contact, younger bears especially may appear uncertain about what humans even are. And perhaps that uncertainty goes both ways, because people encountering wild polar bears often describe a strange emotional contradiction: fear mixed with fascination. The animals feel enormous in person, heavy, silent. Their movement across snow barely makes sound despite their size. Under certain Arctic lighting conditions, they seem to blend into the landscape until unexpectedly close. Some explorers once compared seeing a distant polar bear on sea ice to watching part of the Arctic itself suddenly come alive. And then there are the encounters that seem almost impossible. Researchers and Arctic workers have occasionally described bears sleeping on tiny drifting ice fragments far from stable pack ice, surviving in conditions that appear dangerously exposed. Others have documented individuals swimming through immense stretches of open water under rough weather conditions few animals would willingly enter. One tracked female polar bear reportedly completed a swim so long that scientists initially questioned whether the data contained errors. But the Arctic keeps producing extremes, perhaps because the environment itself pushes survival constantly toward physical limits. Then there are the rare confrontations between adult males. Most of the time, polar bears avoid unnecessary conflict. Injuries in the Arctic can become fatal surprisingly quickly. But during mating season or near important food sources, encounters between large males sometimes escalate into violent dominance struggles. And those battles can feel strangely ancient. Two massive white bears standing upright against each other beneath Arctic wind, their bodies scarred from earlier fights and years of survival on drifting ice. Snow blowing around them while the frozen ocean groans somewhere beneath their feet. Sometimes the confrontation ends with little actual violence after displays of size and strength. Other times, the fights become brutal. Yet even these moments contain uncertainty. Researchers still do not fully understand. How much of polar bear behavior is instinct? How much reflects individual personality, learning, or environmental pressure? Why do some males appear unusually tolerant in certain situations, while others react aggressively almost immediately? The deeper scientists study individual bears, the harder simple explanations become. And individual personality differences may matter more than people once assumed. Some bears are extraordinarily cautious around humans. Others repeatedly investigate camps, equipment, or settlements. Certain mothers behave aggressively near cubs, while others prioritize escape. Researchers working in long-term Arctic studies often begin recognizing specific behavioral tendencies between bears encountered multiple times. In other words, polar bears are not interchangeable. Each animal carries its own experience through the Arctic. Perhaps that is why some of the strangest encounters involve behavior no one predicted beforehand. Bears have been observed playing with unfamiliar objects for extended periods, interacting with discarded debris in curious ways, and even engaging in social behavior more flexible than older scientific assumptions once suggested. Solitary by nature does not necessarily mean emotionally simple, and occasionally the Arctic produces scenes so visually strange they almost feel fictional. A polar bear wandering through abandoned Soviet weather stations, surrounded by rusting metal and drifting snow. A white bear standing beside black volcanic sand under midnight sunlight. A mother crossing floating ice beneath the northern lights, while cubs struggle behind her through freezing fog. The farther north you go, the more the line between documentary and myth sometimes begins to blur. This may explain why polar bears became such powerful symbols in Arctic storytelling for centuries. To many indigenous communities, they represented far more than predators. Bears appeared in stories as intelligent beings, wandering spirits, guardians of the ice, or creatures capable of understanding human intention. Modern science approaches those ideas carefully, of course, but even today, researchers occasionally admit there is something difficult to fully explain about prolonged encounters with polar bears in the wild. The combination of silence, isolation, intelligence, and environmental extremity creates experiences that people often describe long after returning south. Because the Arctic changes perception itself. Distances feel wrong. Time feels slower. Weather transforms landscapes within hours. And inside that unstable environment, the polar bear often appears less like an ordinary animal and more like part of the frozen world, moving independently through the storm. Even now, some of the rarest polar bear behaviors remain poorly documented simply because humans almost never witness them directly. What happens deep in the polar night during violent winter storms? How often do solitary bears interact beyond breeding periods? What unknown travel routes still exist across drifting sea ice beyond satellite coverage gaps and remote regions no research teams reach consistently? There are still pieces missing from the story, and maybe there always will be. Because the Arctic resists complete understanding by its very nature, tonight, somewhere far beyond the last northern settlements, a lone polar bear is crossing broken sea ice under dim Arctic light. Wind erases its tracks almost immediately behind it. The ocean shifts beneath frozen fragments, drifting slowly through darkness. And somewhere inside that enormous white silence, another strange encounter may already be beginning. Far above the northern edge of the world, the Arctic Ocean is still freezing tonight. Sea ice is forming again across dark water beneath the polar sky. Wind is carving new ridges into fresh snow. Somewhere in the distance, a seal surfaces briefly through a breathing hole hidden beneath ice that may drift hundreds of miles before spring arrives. And somewhere out there, a polar bear is walking across a world that no longer behaves exactly the way it once did. The strange thing is, the bear itself may not fully understand that yet, because evolution does not think in years, or decades, or even human lifetimes. Polar bears were shaped across enormous stretches of Arctic history, where change usually arrived slowly enough for survival systems to adapt beside it. Ice advanced. Ice retreated. Populations declined. Populations recovered. The Arctic transformed repeatedly long before humans ever measured temperature or mapped sea ice from space. And somehow, through all of it, the polar bear endured. That may be one reason scientists remain careful whenever discussing the species' future. The Arctic has always changed. Polar bears are not fragile animals in the ordinary sense. They are survivors of one of the harshest environments on Earth. Predators capable of enduring starvation, storms, freezing oceans, months of darkness, and landscapes that physically drift beneath their feet. But surviving hardship is not the same thing as surviving unlimited change, especially when the environment that created you begins shifting faster than expected. For most of their existence, polar bears depended on one thing above almost everything else: predictable access to sea ice. Not permanent ice, not perfect ice, just enough seasonal stability for hunting, movement, denning, and survival to continue functioning across generations. Now, in some Arctic regions, those patterns are becoming less reliable. Sea ice forms later, breaks earlier. Storms move differently. Open water stretches farther north during summer months. And because polar bears evolved around hunting seals from sea ice, even subtle disruptions ripple outward through almost every part of their lives. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: no one fully knows what happens next. Some scientists believe certain polar bear populations may decline significantly if current warming trends continue in heavily affected regions. Others argue the species may prove more adaptable than many predictions assume. Both views contain uncertainty because the Arctic itself remains incredibly difficult to model perfectly, and the bears continue surprising researchers. Some populations already show behavioral flexibility people did not expect decades ago. Bears are spending more time on land in certain regions. Some scavenge whale carcasses more frequently. Others investigate bird colonies, coastal food sources, or entirely new movement routes. In a strange way, the polar bear may currently be experimenting with survival in real time, not consciously perhaps, but biologically. Every altered hunting pattern, every unusual migration, every successful cub raised under changing conditions becomes part of an enormous ongoing test happening across the Arctic right now. And evolution has always worked through experiments. The unsettling question is whether enough successful adaptations can happen quickly enough. Because polar bears are deeply specialized animals. Their enormous bodies, hunting strategies, metabolism, and reproductive systems all evolved around a frozen marine environment. They are not simply white bears living in cold places. They are creatures built specifically for drifting sea ice ecosystems. That specialization made them powerful. It may also make them vulnerable. In biology, highly specialized predators often thrive brilliantly under stable conditions, but struggle when ecosystems transform rapidly. Yet the Arctic rarely behaves according to simple rules. Certain regions may retain productive sea ice far longer than others. Some bears may adapt behaviorally better than expected. Genetic variation between populations could also matter more in the future than scientists currently understand. And then there is the possibility humans rarely think about. The polar bear itself may continue evolving. Not immediately, not dramatically within a few years, but over long enough periods, environmental pressure reshapes species constantly. Ancient brown bears slowly became polar bears through repeated Arctic selection pressures. Future Arctic conditions could eventually favor different traits entirely. Smaller body size, perhaps. Greater flexibility in diet. More time spent on land. Increased hybridization with brown bears in overlapping northern regions. Some of these possibilities remain speculative. Others are already being observed in limited forms. Scientists debate how meaningful certain trends truly are, because distinguishing temporary behavior from long-term evolutionary direction is extremely difficult while change is actively unfolding. But the possibility itself feels remarkable. Imagine a future Arctic where the descendants of modern polar bears no longer resemble the animals humans recognize today. Not extinct, changed, and perhaps that idea feels uncomfortable because people often imagine nature as fixed once they become familiar with it. But the Arctic was never fixed. Even the ice itself constantly moved, fractured, vanished, and returned across history. Polar bears may simply be entering another period of transformation, one more visible to humans because we are watching it happen in real time. Still, there are limits to adaptation. A bear can adjust hunting behavior. It cannot instantly redesign its entire biology. Cubs still depend on successful mothers. Mothers still depend on stored fat. Fat still depends heavily on seal hunting. And seal hunting still depends on sea ice. The deeper scientists study the Arctic, the more they realize how interconnected everything truly is. Ocean temperatures influence ice formation. Ice influences seal behavior. Seal behavior influences polar bear reproduction. Storm timing affects den stability. Snow conditions influence cub survival. Changes ripple outward through the entire ecosystem in ways that often remain invisible at first, which may explain why some Arctic researchers speak about uncertainty with unusual caution. Not because they know nothing, but because they understand how much remains unknown. The Arctic is still one of the least fully understood major ecosystems on Earth. Vast sections remain difficult to monitor consistently through winter darkness and severe weather. Animal behavior shifts faster than long-term data sometimes accumulates. Entire feedback systems between ocean, atmosphere, ice, and biology continue surprising climate scientists even now. And somewhere inside all that complexity walks the polar bear. An animal humans turned into a symbol long before fully understanding the world that shaped it. Perhaps that symbolism matters more than people realize, because when humans look at polar bears, they often see something larger than a predator. They see endurance, isolation, wildness untouched by ordinary civilization. The bear crossing endless sea ice beneath northern light feels almost mythic, because the Arctic itself still feels partly beyond human control. And maybe that is what creates such emotional tension around the species' future. If a creature this perfectly adapted to the frozen north can struggle under environmental pressure, what does that say about the stability of the Arctic itself? But even here, the story refuses to become simple. Polar bears are not disappearing overnight into silence. Many populations still survive across enormous northern regions. Cubs are still being born inside snow dens tonight. Hunts are still unfolding beside seal breathing holes beneath drifting ice. The Arctic is still alive with movement, even as conditions shift around it. And perhaps that balance between resilience and uncertainty is the real story. Not hopelessness, not certainty, but transition. The Arctic entering a period where ancient survival systems are being tested under new conditions no species alive today has fully experienced before. And humans are part of that story too now. Aircraft cross regions once reachable only by sled. Satellites watch ice movement from orbit. Industrial shipping pushes farther north during longer ice-free periods. Coastal communities adapt to changing shorelines and unstable seasonal patterns. Indigenous knowledge and modern climate science increasingly intersect because both are trying to understand the same transforming world from different perspectives. Meanwhile, the bears continue moving, still hunting, still swimming, still crossing drifting ice beneath storms and polar night, exactly as generations before them once did. And maybe the most important thing humans have not fully realized yet is this: the future of the polar bear is not only about one species. It is about the future behavior of the entire Arctic system surrounding it, because polar bears sit near the top of a frozen ecosystem built from ice, ocean currents, seals, fish, snow patterns, storms, and seasonal light. When the bear changes, it may signal deeper changes already happening beneath the surface. The Arctic often whispers before it shouts. Tonight, somewhere beneath the northern lights, a polar bear is still walking across newly formed sea ice while dark water moves silently below. Snow drifts across its tracks almost immediately behind it. Wind carries the scent of seals through the freezing air, and somewhere inside that enormous frozen silence, the future of the Arctic is already unfolding, one winter at a time. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight in the frozen Arctic. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy Secrets and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what topic you'd like me to explore next. Sleep well, stay safe, and have a peaceful night tonight.